There's a ghost town in California that isn't abandoned. 60 people still live there. The power's on. There's a bar on Main Street that serves steaks the size of your head. But walk down the boardwalk and you'll see buildings that are literally tilting into the river. Roofs caving in, porches sagging, foundations that were never built in the first place. This town was built by people who couldn't own the ground under their feet. Chinese immigrants who drained the delta swamps, built the levees, and turned this valley into the richest farmland in America. And then they got told they couldn't own a single inch of it. So they rented. They built the town on borrowed land, and somehow, against every odd, it's still standing. Except it might not be for much longer. You drive through flat farmland to get there, miles of it. Asparagus fields, pear orchards, vineyards, the kind of rich black soil that makes things grow. And that's not by accident. The Chinese laborers who settled here literally built this farmland out of swamp. The town itself is tiny. One main street, maybe 3 blocks long, wooden buildings on both sides, 2 stories max, boardwalk connecting it all. It looks like a Western movie set, except nobody built it as a set. People lived here, and still do. The first thing you notice is the condition of the buildings. Some of them are fine, painted, maintained, businesses still running. Al the Wops has been serving burgers and steaks since 1934. The Locke Garden restaurant still does dim sum. There's an art gallery, a little museum. On weekend afternoons, tourists poke around, take photos, and buy trinkets. But the next building over might have a roof caving in, windows boarded up, a porch that's pulling away from the wall at a 10-degree angle. These buildings didn't have foundations because they were never supposed to be permanent. The men who built them figured they'd make their money and go home to China. That was the plan. The plan didn't work out. So at the end of Main Street, you'll hit a levee. Climb up and you'll see the Sacramento River. Wide, brown, moving slow, and on the other side, more farmland, flat to the horizon. This river is why the town of Locke exists, and it's also why it might not survive. Every flood season, the water comes up and the town sits below the levee. So the history of Locke, how this all happened? Well, here's the short version. Chinese immigrants started coming to California during the gold rush, 1848 and onward. Most didn't strike it rich, but when the gold ran out, they found other work. They built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, hanging off cliffs, blasting through granite, 12,000 of them. Then, when the railroad was done, white workers accused them of taking their jobs. So California passed a foreign miners tax, then the alien land tax of 1913. You couldn't own land unless you were eligible for citizenship, and Chinese immigrants weren't. But here's the thing about the Delta. The white landowners needed the Chinese. They were the only ones who knew how to drain swamps and build levees. They came from the Pearl River Delta in the Guangdong province of China, where they'd been doing exactly this work for generations. So the landowners made them a deal. You can't own the land, but you can rent it. You can work it, farm it, but just don't expect to keep it. So in 1912, 4 Chinese businessmen leased land from a man named George Locke. They built a few buildings. Then in 1915, fire destroyed the Chinatown in the nearby town of Walnut Grove, and hundreds of families needed somewhere to go. They all came to Locke, and the town exploded. For a brief window, Locke was the Monte Carlo of California. This was during Prohibition, 1920 to 1934. Locke was its own little world out in the Delta, nobody watching too close. 5 gambling parlors running full blast, speakeasies, brothels, opium dens tucked behind commercial storefronts. You'd walk past what looked like a grocery store, and in the back room, something else entirely was happening. On weekends, the population swelled to over 1,000. People flew in from Hollywood, San Francisco. There were mink coats, boats pulling up to the dock. The town had a dentist, a doctor, a theater, grocery stores, restaurants, and boarding houses. 5 brothels, a handful of opium dens nobody asked too many questions about. It was a self-contained Chinese village in rural California where kids ran the streets and doors were never locked. But it couldn't last. A couple of things killed Locke. The Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943. That was a good thing, except it meant that the kids of Locke could finally get their citizenship, go to college, get degrees, and they did. They went to UC Berkeley. They became engineers, doctors, and teachers, and none of them wanted to come back and live in a crumbling Delta town with no foundations. Then, in 1951, the state finally shut down the illegal gambling. The weekend crowds vanished and the economy collapsed. By the 1970s, most of the Chinese families had moved out. A few remained, but Locke was fading. In 1990, the federal government named Locke a National Historic Landmark. It was the largest, most complete example of a rural agriculture Chinese American community in the United States. The only one left in the country. Every other town like it, gone, bulldozed, burned, or just rotted away. But there's one thing about being a National Historic Landmark: nobody writes you a check. The designation doesn't come with any money. These buildings needed millions of dollars of work. Today there are about 60 residents left. Only a handful are Chinese. The Locke Foundation and a few dedicated people fight to keep the building standing, but it's in a holding action, repairing what they can and watching what they can't. Locke isn't a ghost town in the traditional sense. The lights are still on. People live here. You can still get a cold beer and a steak, but it's a ghost of what it was, the Monte Carlo of California. The Chinese immigrants built on land they could never own, a place that survived because it was isolated, ignored, and too small to bother bulldozing. And now, a landmark that might not outlast the people trying to save it. If you want to go see it, you better go soon. It's not clear how much longer these buildings are going to stand. And that's the story of the ghost town of Locke. 60 people still call it home. The rest just drive through. Not bad for a town no one was allowed to own. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe. It's free and it'll really help out the channel.